Alan, so glad to have you on the show, man.
Thanks, Shane. Good to be here.
How did you end up being the personal chef for Tom Brady and Giselle?
Yeah, so I believe everything happens for a reason. And so here I am in Miami, like 1,200 miles from where I'm from, which is Boston. And actually had met Tom very briefly in 2002. Uh, some people knew who he was, but he was still sort of just making his way into the Boston kind of scene as an athlete. And then he came into the restaurant I worked at very often. So anyway, there was a connection because that was the time he won a lot of Super Bowls. And then here I am in Miami, what, 15, no, like 11 years later, and I meet his previous chef. Um, a mutual friend introduced us because we were just very similar philosophies and very similar approach to food. Um, we had coffee. He told me he had a couple of clients that he wanted me to fill in for, and it happened to be Tom and Giselle. And at the time, I'm in Miami and I'm loving my life and I'm building a business. About 6 months into sort of being self-employed and walking down that path of an entrepreneur, and had even started to talk to investors about building out this pretty cool project. Literally had plans in place, but nothing was finalized yet. And so, long story short, I fill in for him in LA for I think it was a 10-day stint, and he gave his notice at that time. So they asked me on the spot to kind of basically drop everything and go back to Boston and be their chef. Needless to say, I was back in Boston in a month, and I kind of left everything dead in its tracks and drove back to Boston. And yeah, so it just happened very suddenly. I didn't know that chef beforehand. We had just met. It happened very quick. Yeah.
What is that philosophy of food that you're talking about?
So at the time, I had been a traditional chef my whole life, working in high end, French, Italian, American cuisine. And so in Miami, 2009 is when I moved there. And by the end of 2009, I had started to, look at my own lifestyle, my own eating habits, and, you know, exercise and that kind of thing. And sort of had my own epiphany around food and around plant based food, especially, and how important it was not only for human health to focus on plants, but also for the environment. And I felt so passionately and so strong about it that I started to blog and study and research and watch documentaries. And so here I meet them, and they're looking for the very similar philosophy where it's mostly plant based, but we still have sustainable animal protein, uh, wild caught fish, and we inevitably, avoid certain foods that are drug like and that are food like products like gluten, dairy, and sugar. Um, and so anyway, that was the biggest connection. And at the time, I didn't realize that there was really a market for this because, like I said, I had come from sort of high end cuisine and hotels, and I wasn't really aware that there was at that time, 2011, 12, there was about to be this huge shift in culture, and here we are today with massive, plant based food brands and concepts. So
I want to come back to the gluten, sugar, dairy thing in a second, but you've in the meantime, like you've worked with a ton of people that need to be at their peak physical performance over the
mhm.
years. I'm curious as to what patterns you see. What do they do, and what do they avoid?
So with me, like I still have that passion to create an experience, and I still love all things edible, right? That's what a chef loves the most, is to create an experience for you that's going to leave a mark in your memory and really create nostalgia. And that's, I still have that. I'm not um, trying to be this really radical influence in your life. You can't do this and you can't do that and you have to do this. Like, that's not fun. Um, so it's really not for me. It's not what they have to avoid. It's what they need to include, and it's foods that are high in antioxidants. Like I said, back to the plant-based foods, good for recovery, for longevity, and then the whole sustainability piece helps with like the mental component of food. And we're eating all day, every day, most of us. So a lot of us, once we start sort of jump into this mindset of eating, we become more aware and conscious of what we're eating. And so to have that element of this is sustainable not only for me but for my surroundings and my planet and my habitat that I'll leave on to those around me when I leave this planet, just kind of adds another layer of comfortability and that longevity piece that we don't always think about.
I'm interested in peak mental performance. Like, how does food help us or get in the way of that?
So, I mean, you and I talked briefly about what happens when we go back to sort of refined foods, and the sluggishness is almost instantly, right? There's a couple pieces there, right? So, like culturally, the foods that we grew up on and that homemade, moms or grandma, whatever it is that brings that love and that joy can help with the mindset, right? That is comforting and loving, and that can help us maybe get to a certain place in our mind and in our even in our performance, I believe. But then there's another component where when someone may have been eating a certain way for X amount of time, and they're young athletes, and some of these young athletes they perform. They're some of the best. Some of the biggest athletes in the world actually will openly talk about eating fast food. So it's really not always that. But as we get older, um, if and when there is a shift in what we're eating, you can see a profound change in performance based on what you're consuming every day. And that's undeniable. That's science. That's not a trend or some theory. And that tends to be, like I said, back to like the plant-based foods and foods that are more nutrient dense, foods that digest better, the right combination of foods at the right times during the day. Um, it's not a one size fits all, but in a nutshell, that's kind of been my experience.
So, just to give everybody context, I've sort of lived this way of eating, call it paleo and veganism at the same time, or I think that the word going around now is paganism.
Veganism, yeah, Mark Hyman, yeah.
Yeah. So I've lived this for the past month. When people talk
Yeah.
about how much research I do for a podcast, I've strictly held to this. I've deviated twice. I had gluten once and I had dairy once. And I'm curious as to why no gluten, why no dairy, and why no refined sort of sugar. And if you can walk us through each one of those and the impact it has on our body.
Yeah, so like anybody else, like let me remind you that I was a traditional chef my whole life, and Italian food and even the house I grew up in, we enjoyed pasta and bread just like anybody else. Um, but with knowledge and with my own experience with health issues and digestive problems, and I've been a workhorse my whole life. So although I'm not out there, playing competitive sports, it's still a very taxing workday for a chef on your body. So let's start with gluten. So gluten is really wheat isn't the problem. It's kind of what we've done to it. We started to grow this very short plant in a very short amount of time, which had concentrated amounts of gluten and starch. So like super starches and super high amounts of gluten, and that's where we saw all the problems. And a lot of it is the gut. We have this gut that wants to be nourished in a pretty specific way. It wants to have a certain amount of prebiotics and probiotics and good bacteria and a really sort of complex amount of different foods and bacteria that will ultimately help us to thrive, right? And that wheat that we've now genetically modified is almost like throwing in some chemicals that just taste really good and they're packaged really well and they're attractive because they're on TV and kids love them, and maybe the kids that are begging for them, they'll be better behaved when you give it to them. And it's whatever, it is what it is, and we all seek that kind of instant gratification through food. um, but ultimately it may be to our demise because the gluten specifically um, is directly linked to a lot of these health problems that we have. um, so like I said, it's not the wheat as a species, it's what we've done to it. And it's also how we're handling it. So we're not sprouting it and fermenting it and milling it. Um, it's something I'm very passionate about is teaching my employees about sprouting grains and why do we do that and the anti-nutrients and their defense mechanism compared to an animal. Animal has teeth and claws. Plants don't. Plants will actually defeat their enemy while they're dead. They don't have a defense, but what they do have is this built-in anti-nutrient that will bloat the animal or the human, you know, and there's things that we need to do to break down that plant the way we break down that animal in order to consume it and have it be the most, you know, beneficial to our health. Um, and so, like I said, wheat that's grown the way it used to be grown back in the early 1900s and that's sprouted or fermented. Um, sourdough bread is probably the biggest trend in 2020, and I'd like to think that people may have read into why sourdough bread is better. Um, I can go on and on about gluten, but that's my thing, and it's really not that wheat is the enemy. It's kind of what we've done to it, and how it's kind of destroyed the lining of our stomachs and our immune system. Mhm.
Two follow-on questions to that. One, why is sourdough bread better? And two, is wheat the same all over the world? Because is it different in Europe than it is here?
Yeah, it definitely is. I'm not going to say they're not genetically modifying it, but for the most part, they're ancient. You know, we've been around just, you know, very short time compared to these other ancient countries. So their cultures are more deeply rooted in these processes that are really ingrained in them. So for them to steer from what they grew up with for years and generations, it's less likely than it is for us Americans. So yeah, so more people say than not, they go to Europe, they have the pasta, they have the pizza, they don't feel the bloating, they don't feel the side effects that they do when they come to the US.
That's really interesting. And why sourdough bread?
Oh, so sourdough bread, it's the fermentation process, you know, it's allowing that yeast to ferment, and also the flour is most likely fermented as well. It's that process of breaking down, like I said, those anti-nutrients and allowing that bread to be more easily digestible, um, and also giving the body a chance to assimilate the nutrients instead of having actually the opposite, which would be to pull the nutrients from our body when we don't do that. Um, so it's just one step in the process that makes all the difference in the world when it comes to gluten. Actually, two steps: growing and then how we handle it.
And what about dairy?
So dairy is also, um, you know, there's a lot about dairy, and I'm no expert. What I get about dairy is the casein. You know, the A1 casein. That's the problem. Directly linked to cancer and the hormones, and especially conventional milk and milk products, cheeses. Um, But then you have like the fat, which is has a lot of benefits. The clarified butter, aka ghee, it's very different than just having 16 ounces of conventional dairy cow's milk every day. It's not the same. You know, not every cow is raised the same way. Um, but they say, you know, cow's milk is the perfect food for baby calves. You know, it's not fit for human consumption. It's meant for the baby cow to grow quite a bit in a very short period of time. And here we are, like no other species does this but us. No other species will drink another mammal's milk by choice, right? You may see it if they're starving, you know, rarely, but um, anyway, we've got to look at that. We've got to look at our what's much more of a epidemic, pandemic than any virus will ever be, is our dietary related disease. We've got to look at these things. And for me, dairy, gluten, and sugar are the glaringly obvious that we need to look at those things.
Yeah, there's definitely an aspect to how it's affected people who are overweight, right? In terms of and how these contribute to us being overweight. I'm curious, are there elements of dairy that we can have? Like if we eliminate milk and sort of cheese, like you mentioned ghee, are there other elements of dairy that are sort of good for us or beneficial?
Yeah,
Butter, for instance?
so butter, grass-fed butter isn't the worst, and it's not a one size fits all. Like most people are lactose intolerant, but some aren't. More people are lactose intolerant than aren't. So if you are, obviously should stay away from it. But if you feel as though you're digesting milk properly, it's not causing, for me, for example, I will break out, I will have a stuffy nose, and I'll be lethargic if I have dairy. You know, that's kind of been a thing for me for a while. I thought I had permanent acne on my back and on my skin that went away when I dropped dairy. So there's a direct connection for me. And I was like a young, you know, high school, college, chugging protein shakes, trying to get big like most men do at that age. And it's just so taxing on our organs too. You know, it's brutal. Yeah, it's the fat. If anything, go for ghee. You know, that's where you're going to find the science and the research that that is actually really good. It's the proteins, mostly the casein, that is directly linked to cancer growth. Um, and it's the A1 casein. It's not the A2, which is found in the like goat's milk. Um, so yeah, we can't deny. We just got to look at the research when it comes to that.
So if you're gonna have cheese, can you have goat's cheese?
It's better, yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have that harmful casein that cow's milk has. So it's like an
Oh, that's
A2
super.
casein. I think they're even making like A2 branding it this way too. A2 milk. I think I've seen that at the store, like A2 casein milk. Because this information is getting out there. People are more aware of this. Plant-based milk is having a big impact on the dairy industry. They're hurting.
And talk to me about sugar.
So sugar, I think, is the obvious. I think that's why we kept it for last because it's pretty obvious that white sugar is probably one of the worst things that we can consume. I didn't talk about the drug-like effect with dairy or gluten. Sugar is probably has more of a drug-like effect than those things, but they actually all do. With dairy, it's the casomorphins that you literally affect the reward system the way that cocaine and heroin would in an addict. And sugar is the same thing, you know. Um, Looking at diabetes and this diabetes type 2 diabetes epidemic that we have, uh, it's just crazy to think that 1 in 2 Americans will end up like diabetic, you know? Um, Super addictive. There's a reason why it's in all processed foods. Like these companies know that it will keep us coming back, and that's why they do it. You got to be one step ahead of them. And I think eliminating white sugar will give your brain, body, and mind a chance to actually have a choice and a decision when you're in that store hungry because you've worked all day and you're dying for something to eat, but that knowledge of that sugar will actually keep me addicted. Um, anyway, those are my reasons for avoiding sugar completely.
I found the sugar thing really interesting because everything tasted sweet after about 4 to 5 days of no sugar. Like blueberries just tasted like ridiculously sweet, and
Yeah, I have your palate
strawberries.
back. Uh huh.
Yeah, it was so interesting to sort of experience that. And I'm not a high sugar consumer to begin with. And I found it really interesting how everything almost started to taste sweet after not having it for a while.
Yeah, I was that kid that loved candy and like just ran around all day, super hyper. And I remember when I was about 7 or 8, my mom took me off of like soda, and she tried anyway, soda, cookies, stuff like that. She says that it helped calm me down. Back in those days, you know, they didn't really diagnose yet as far as like ADD and whatever. But I was super hyperactive, and anyway, so those eating habits went well into my, my teenage years and my 20s. So I also, when I cut out sugar, it was withdrawals. It was a big life change for sure.
Yeah, you definitely set your patterns sort of as teens and young adults in terms of how you eat and what you think. I'm curious, you mentioned sort of earlier about prebiotic and probiotic and gut health. Can you walk me through a little bit about that and how you think about that?
If we look at our belly like this, I mean, I'm a chef, so maybe this is a good metaphor for me, but it's like this really amazing, complex soup, right? That we need to start a certain way. So, like sweating the vegetables just the right way so that ultimately that will enhance the overall flavor of the soup and maybe add to the viscosity and like whatever, right? I don't know. I'm trying to give an example of why prebiotics make sense, and it's mostly the fiber that will be feeding this good bacteria and also set yourself up for what you're about to eat throughout the day. And hopefully, you're going to eat those foods in the right combination to allow that bacteria and those digestive enzymes to work the way that they want to. Um, so prebiotics would be mostly inulin is what comes to mind first, which is in some vegetables and even like green banana. Um, and then probiotics, fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, that kind of thing. Not everybody loves those things. Um, but if you look at the benefits, and you can certainly take probiotics if you want to. I'm just a big fan of like really incorporate because it's easy to just take a pill. If you just take a pill for everything you need to do, you're never gonna wrap your mind around what this is doing for me and why I should do it and embrace it, and just realize like I'm a human being. This is what I have to do to sustain my health because pills aren't the answer, right? Whether it's a probiotic pill or not. Some cases we need it, but I think, with the right balanced diet of, like I said, fermented vegetables and prebiotic fruits and vegetables at the beginning of the day and throughout the day, um, it's really just about, having those things in place and having a game plan and knowing I have this gut that needs to be taken care of as if I have a little child that needs to be fed a certain way every day. And it's my responsibility to do that, or else I'm going to physically be the one that suffers. Um, if that little child, aka my gut, is malnourished and isn't fed the right way. I don't really know how else to say it, but that's kind of how I look at it. Like we've got to feed this gut the way we would feed a pet or an actual human being. We're going to give it what it needs to thrive. And I think probiotics, prebiotics, and also the right food combining is the way to do that.
So what are some other examples of prebiotic foods that we can have? So you mentioned green bananas, and what was the other one you mentioned?
Yeah, so high fiber foods, artichokes are good. Um, Cruciferous are good. Yeah, it's mostly foods that are high in inulin.
And then probiotic, what would be good for probiotic?
So the easiest ones that are probably the most familiar, kimchi. If you go to like a health food store, you're going to see a whole array of fermented vegetables, whether it's carrots, beets, kimchi would be like cabbage, like there's all types of fermented foods. And then you just have pickles that we all grew up on, pickles, right? Obviously, you don't want to
Yeah.
have like GMO, like really cheap vinegar. Like the vinegar does matter too. Um, Apple cider vinegar is really good. Like just really quality, like simple ingredients. There shouldn't be any sugar in there. It should be natural lacto fermented foods that will ferment on their own, right? Um, and these days, I feel as though there's so many options. You can just buy the juice if you want. You just want to have shots of fermented liquid, the juice from those plants. You can just take a few shots of that every day. So I think the options are endless. It's just really looking at fermented foods as a flavor profile as well. Like we look for salt, sweet, savory, spicy, but getting familiar with fermented and sort of looking for that intuitively in our dishes will kind of help. And I think that's something that I do when I try to balance a dish, a meal. The fermented piece always kind of almost always fits into that equation.
Are there other things that we should eliminate from the diet or from what we're eating? I don't want to call it a diet, but from like what we're eating. What else? What would be number 4 and 5 if you could pick two extra ones to get people to stop eating?
I mean, I focus on whole foods, and to be honest, if it's not a whole food, we shouldn't really be eating it, right? Um, I think the next in line would be refined oils, especially like seed oils, um, and any other really preservatives and additives, MSG and that kind of thing. Yeah, I think those would be next in line.
It was really interesting for me when I first got your some of the recipes you shared with me. I went to the grocery store and I was like, "Oh, this will be so easy, right? I'll just switch out milk for almond milk. I'll switch out cheese for cashew cheese." And then I started sort of texting you. I'm like, "There's 18 things in this almond milk. Like, is that it's not that easy." I thought it was really interesting in terms of how I thought it would be easy to substitute some of the things that I had versus how it actually played out in real life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a chef, so I'm probably a bit biased, but I think, the same way we invested time in our career and our education and building bonds with those that we love, we've got to invest the time in learning how to nourish this body that we live in. And part of that means like I said, I'm biased because I'm a chef and I do this and this is my business. But, knowing how to make the almond milk, knowing how to make and enjoy and embrace those foods that are actually going to benefit you the most. Um, yeah. So, because we can't rely on anything that's in a package. It's very rare that we can rely on a big company to have our best interest in mind. They want to make a profit. We are a consumer to them. They don't care about our health most of the time. Um, so yeah, the almond milk is simple. It's just almonds, water, blend it, nut milk bag, done.
Yeah, I want to. We'll come back to this in a second because I definitely want to explore this a little more. And one of the big sort of roadblocks for me, in terms of how this played out over a month. But I'm curious, going back to just the gluten, the dairy, the sugar. Is there a difference between no gluten, dairy, sugar, and like I have it once a week, or how do you think about that? Like, is it easier just to say no and eliminate it versus tempting yourself? Because I would imagine also your body wants to tease you. Yes, you're in control. You can have it just once, but then it's like you can't just have one chip, right? You got to have another one and another one.
I think it comes down to this, and I can't deny. We just talked about the drug like effect that these things have, right? So if I'm avoiding dairy and sugar and gluten, and then like 3 weeks later, I'm still having this crazy desire to consume those things, probably still somewhat addicted to them, right? Um, I know because I've been there, right? And I've been heavily addicted to foods, and I know what that's like. So I would take a look at that piece first, because for me, for example, I had pizza about a year and a half ago. I was with a friend that's from Boston but was visiting. She now lives in Miami, and I had never gone to Sant'Apio. It was supposed to be the best pizza in East Boston. It's been there for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And she wanted to go. And I'm like, I hadn't seen her in a long time, very close friends, and we went and we had pizza and it was delicious. And I actually didn't even feel that bad afterwards. But, did I crave it? Did I like, no, it was just sort of like a cultural thing, and she was sort of in the same sort of diet where she doesn't eat these things either. We just kind of did it as like a bonding thing, like, welcome back to Boston. Um, anyway, so yeah, I think it's like we got to take a look at, is it like a drug like craving? And if that's what it is, then I would suggest not having it. But if it's like a casual kind of, oh, it happens to be there and it's in this sort of like social situation, I think that's different. I do think there's a difference though.
Like when I found you, I reached out because I was like, I want to be my best self when I'm 70. And what are the things I need to be doing now to make sure that's possible, even though I'm in my 40s? And you were adamant about eliminating these things, and I thought that was really interesting in terms of the approach. And so it was less about a diet and more about just don't eat these, avoid certain things.
Yeah, I don't like the word diet either because diet sounds restrictive. It's just not a fun word. I want food to be fun and exciting. And that's the reason why, marketing and advertising, they do a lot to our psyche. You keep telling someone this is fun and exciting and this is a place you can, bond with your family at a playground at a fast food joint, like, um, that's attractive. If you tell someone you have to shovel this in your mouth in order to be healthy and live until you're 70 and be strong, it's not fun. It's not exciting. It's not going to make me and if I had young kids, jump and get to your restaurant. Um, so we got to look at that component of it, and that's what I'm trying to do. I want to make it so that this these whole foods that I didn't make it up. This isn't my philosophy. This is a philosophy that I think makes the most sense for us as human beings. How do we just make those foods more enjoyable and nostalgic and familiar and fun? Yeah, so I did a cleanse in Miami with a couple of friends, and I still in the hotel business and still not really, very little experience with plant-based food. Didn't even know the difference between vegan and vegetarian back then. And they friends that like just had the right amount of influence on me without being pushy or anything. And we had made friends, and then they both happen to be vegan. One is still, and one isn't. Um, just people that I respected and I looked up to, and they said, "Hey, you want to do this cleanse with us? We're going to do a fruit and vegetable cleanse." And I did it with them. And when I talk about this epiphany, I guess that's when I had this kind of epiphany. I had never done anything like that in my life. And all it really meant was I ate fruits and vegetables only for 3 days. And I was still working in a very, very busy venue at a hotel in Miami Beach. Um, and I had just never felt that way in my life where I actually felt everything after that point, everything that I was eating, I felt it, you know? And it just opened my eyes. And like I said, it was a very quick, kind of like profound experience that I had that it just propelled me to like I'd be in my apartment on a Friday night, like researching and writing blogs, and I was just like jumped in both feet. And I just really never looked back. Yeah, so nuts are good. It's just in moderation, right? Because they still have a good amount of omega sixes. And so when I think of nuts, like I actually sell in my business, I sell nuts and seeds because the nuts alone are great, but mixing them with seeds that most of them have a higher amount of omega 3s as well to kind of keep that balance. Not that anyone's going to live off of nuts and seeds. Um, but I think that's my indirect way of kind of showing someone how to snack on nuts is to also include some seeds. And also sprouting them. So, I mean, walnuts are at the top of the list for sure. Hemp hearts are good, although they're not like pumpkin seeds that you can just grab. But I think a nice mix of pumpkin seeds and hemp hearts and walnuts is a really good mix. A little bit of like Ceylon cinnamon, and then yeah, definitely sprouting nuts and even seeds the way you do with grains and beans is going to also help break down any lectins or phytic acid and make those nutrients more bioavailable because they still have that same defense mechanism that grains, we talked about that, grains and beans have. It's just not as high as grains and beans. So if you really wanted to get the most out of nuts, you would be soaking or buying them sprouted. So sprouted, kind of like we talked about the wheat thing, right? What happened with wheat, right? We started to genetically modify it, and therefore concentrated the amount of gluten, the proteins in there, and the starch, and that's where a lot of the issues came from. Nuts are nowhere in that category, but let's put them in the same sort of area. So nuts have also phytic acid and lectins, just not as bad. Some people will get bloated when they eat raw nuts and they can't eat raw nuts. They can eat them roasted, they can eat them sprouted, but they can't eat them raw. Um, so yeah, it breaks down those lectins and those that phytic acid and makes the nutrients more bioavailable. Soaking them overnight could do it, especially for the smaller ones like almonds. Um, and then another way would be also roasting. Roasting does the same thing. So as simple as dry roasting, almonds and walnuts and even cashews is going to also break down that phytic acid and those lectins. Yeah, so it's the same idea. It's like if we could look at plants like or just look at nature like everything has been given an equal chance for survival, we maybe better understand that they actually have it. Plants are fascinating. If we read into what they are capable of, they don't have nervous system. Obviously, they don't have a physical defense mechanism, but they do have anti-nutrients that are built within them that they'll do what they want their predator to do. They'll have, whether it's float them so they won't come back and eat them, or take their seeds and poof them out somewhere else in order to help, grow the species. Like they're really a lot more than just this like sedentary thing that grows out of the ground. Um, and so with quinoa is technically a seed. Most grains are seeds. Um, they're bound up with this defense mechanism that from one perspective tells us not to eat them, right? It's gonna bloat us, most of us that are sensitive to it. It's actually harder to eat when they're in that form. So the sprouting, again, it goes back to breaking down that phytic acid and making those nutrients more bioavailable so that it can be assimilated, as opposed to the opposite, which will pull nutrients out of whatever eats it. And that's its defense mechanism. It has a very subtle but what could be deadly, right, to certain predators that eat it. So, anyway, if we look at it from that perspective, I think we'll better understand the way that we break down the animal, we got to break down the plant. Yeah, the acidulated water will help. break through. If you put too much vinegar, now you're gonna like ferment it, and it's not enjoyable. You can't really eat it if it's all mushy, right? But that would be like a step beyond that. The vinegar would actually eat away at the grain itself, and it would just be this like mushy mess. So if that helps, and that's obviously really depleted of any phytic acid and lectins. So one that I try to incorporate more is millet. Millet's not really that popular in our culture at all, but it's a complete protein, meaning that it has all nine essential amino acids like quinoa and also amaranth. They're just not as like enjoyable. You wouldn't have a millet bowl, which is millet and vegetables. Like I put it in like little rice cakes. I do like half rice, half millet, or I'll put it in like I usually fold it in with another more familiar grain, but I do use it. I use it almost every week in my plant-based menu. So it's not that it's not uh, approachable. You just have to know how to use it, really. I mean, I don't think salt is the enemy. I have a couple clients, and obviously there's a issue with hypertension and that kind of thing. But like I said, I don't think salt is the enemy. I don't. Good salt. Obviously, iodized salt is not. It's depleted substance that then iodine's added back to it. It's crap. But sea salt is actually good. We need sodium. Um, so no, I don't think so. I mean, obviously there's some issues where people need to lessen the amount of salt, but I don't think salt is the enemy. So I think it's planning. You know, it's one of the services that I offer for that same reason is like, first of all, we've got to get decent in the kitchen. We've got to get decent with a knife, with like, I mean, most of us that have a kitchen to work out of, we've gotten that far. So we can make a list, we can make a shopping list, we can load the dishwasher, we can, you know, we know some basics in the kitchen. Um, and we sort of start somewhere. So, for example, there's been times in my life, and I know how to cook, but times in my life where my meal prep was literally like baked sweet potatoes, cooked lentils, cooked brown rice, cooked quinoa, and I didn't even use like garlic and onion or anything. And I'd buy like avocados and fresh kale, and I would have like good olive oil, and I just kind of like lived on that. That was my staple kind of food every, you know, 9 to 5 food I called it. Um, because I didn't have the time and I was focusing on other things, and it was like sustenance instead of like this culinary experience every time I ate. So it's really like, let's start somewhere. What's your skill level? Um, and just start with the basics. Like I said, baking a sweet potato is super easy. You wash it, put it on a baking sheet, and you bake it. You know, getting a hold of the process, getting a hang of how to cook rice and grains, and um, most of us know how to cook animal protein too. It's really that we can't cook animal protein. It's the type of protein we're buying and how much of it we're eating. So I don't want to act like animal protein isn't a part of this meal plan, because it certainly is. Um, and yeah, it's all never cooking just one portion, always cooking at least 3 to 4 portions at a time. You know, you have to eat tomorrow and the next day. If you're going to dirty the kitchen and wait, you know, spend time in there, you might as well bulk it up, um, and invest in stocking the pantry with like couple pounds of that, couple pounds of that, a good size thing of salt and pepper and spices. And once you make the monetary investment and it's in the cabinets and it's in the fridge and the freezer, that may be more motivation to use it up before it goes bad, or use it up before the expiration date goes. And um, yeah, there's little ways around it, to really make it more efficient and consistent. I mean, I'm ironing out the details. My next project is a market. It's a market with a dining room and meal delivery. So that question you asked is exactly the answer. That's my business basically. And there are some recipe kits where you basically buy the box, it's delivered to your house. It's usually only enough for like a meal, one meal for two people. So that doesn't quite answer the problem, answer the question that you're asking with the, you know, for this problem. Um, if we look at it, which is rare, but I think it's still something to be mindful of, is this community. Like we back in the day, we used to live in villages, right? And we used to one person would grow that, one person would grow that, one person and would share it. And that's amazing. And I crave that personally. I would love to create that in my own life. But I think there's a way to go about it, even if it's within your own family and within your own neighbor, your own neighborhood is like having some type of like community based sort of, I don't know. I think I'm more wishful thinking than anything because I live in a city right now where it's pretty much not ever going to happen. Um, but I feel as though it's not far fetched to think that, and people are definitely doing this. It's just rare. To think that we can have that again, and we can kind of look at our neighbors in that way and connect with them and bond with them in that way, that we're living close to each other, we're kind of living together. How can we benefit each other in that way to create a better quality of life? So it's, you hit a turning point with any business, and I have so much integrity, sometimes like defect, because it's physically exhausting, right? To be so like involved in every little step. Um, but it starts with the founder, right? It starts with me and like where's my head at? What is my intention first of all? Is it to make money? Is it only to make money? Is it to manipulate people's minds into buying my food because I'm gonna all the trickery that happens with marketing and advertising? So instead, I've done the opposite and I've kept my business private so that you can't just order from my website. You have to send us an email. We're going to have a little talk because I'm not ready to scale yet. So for me, it's been about the team. Honestly, finding talented team members to work in my business has been super challenging. Um, it's kind of a complex business, and my philosophy is different than most here in Boston. And so to find chefs and cooks and even dishwashers that can kind of conform to these new ways has been difficult. And we're just in a weird time with what's happening with like unemployment benefits. And so small businesses are not at a great advantage right now as far as that goes. Um, so that's been a challenge. And then I would say another challenge is sourcing organic and really wanting to have and be consistent, right? So if I'm telling you, let's say you're my consumer, I'm going to be organic, I'm going to be small batch, I'm going to be as local as I can. Those three things, if you're making those three statements, you're you have a lot. You just bitten off a lot. Can you chew that? Like that's quite a bit to say. Small batch means you're not mass producing this. This is made with love. It's made with good intentions. It's made with quality ingredients, and it's not just a conveyor belt of crap going out the door. And to be organic and to be certified organic is also challenging. We have a 4-month growing season, so it doesn't leave me many options. I have to source from other parts of the country, um, and therefore pay a premium. So all in all, like for this particular meal delivery concept, it's a reason I want to get into the market in other areas as well. It is challenging, and therefore my prices have to be a little bit above what you might spend at like a mass produced. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but a mass produced meal plan service that is not claiming these things that I really stand by, um, and also having the ability to accommodate like specific dietary needs, people that have autoimmune conditions, people that have even diabetes, and other complicated health issues. It's certainly been a challenge, but it's a challenge that I'm up for, and it's doable. I wouldn't waste my time if it wasn't. There's certainly a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's going to take certain steps in making certain things priority over others. So the first thing that comes to mind, people ask me this, is glyphosate. So glyphosate is something they will spray non-organic crops with. It helps like that consistency and that, the yield and profit. Always the bottom line is always the profit. Um, and there have now been lawsuits settled in favor of the victims for the but because of glyphosate. So we know, we've known for a while, but we definitely know glyphosate is a huge, huge problem. Um, and you cannot be certified organic and also use glyphosate. So just sticking to like the research and what the science says, glyphosate is probably the biggest deciding factor in wanting to go certified organic. And not all fruits and vegetables have to be organic to avoid glyphosate. Not all fruits and vegetables have to be sprayed so heavily in order to grow consistently. Um, like sweet potatoes, for example, onions, certain things do not have to be certified. But things like berries and certain fruits, they definitely do because they will have to be sprayed heavily in order to avoid pests and to keep them consistent. Um, so yeah, it's definitely the glyphosate. So with fish, you can have farmed fish that's like in the size of a swimming pool, and they don't even have. They're just literally like on top of each other all day, like, and they're eating their own feces, and they're being fed like, you know, their neighbors that were died, and they ground them up and fed them back. Like, it can be really disgusting. Not every fish farm is done that way. There's some farmed fish that is actually done the right way, and they have them in a, sort of a pen that's in the ocean, and they're fed and they're in their natural environment, and that's a lot different. Um, and then you could have wild fish that, the argument would be that they have plastics and they're out there eating plastics in the ocean, and all fish has plastic. And so anyway, there's like, for me, when it comes to fish, yes, I definitely go wild. Um, but also maybe once a week at most. That's really the amount of fish that I'll serve and that I'll eat usually. Um, so yeah, I think that those two things is what kind of farm are these fish being raised in, and then also where was that wild fish caught and how big is it, right? So how big that fish is will determine how much mercury it has. So let's go for like the little guys, like the anchovy and the sardines and the mackerel, um, that aren't as popular and as fun as like tuna and swordfish and these other big fish that are full of mercury. Um, so for me, like the sardines and the mackerel and the anchovies, I would rather stick to those than just eat a whole bunch of really overly fished like tuna and salmon and that kind of thing. So the safe play at restaurants, to be honest, I mean, I guess it does depend where you live because you could be in an area that's like, these restaurateurs are so passionate about farm to table that like, I have a place near me that I just discovered. They own the farm that they source from. It's an organic farm about 100 miles away. Like, they literally own the farm. Like, that's ideal. Like, they're most likely, and the website is full of all this information about sustainability and how passionate they are, and you got to sort of take them. They literally, the restaurant's named after the farm that they source from, that they own. So yeah, gravitate towards those guys and less stress about decision making. But if you end up in some, like, corporatized restaurant concept that has 100 locations across the country, it's more likely that they have to source hundreds and thousands of pounds of XYZ, and therefore may not have the best supply chain, um, like decisions around supply chain. So if they're not saying it on the menu, guess what? It's probably genetically modified. It's probably conventional, and they're not paying. They were paying the price for quality, sustainable, organic proteins. They would say it. If they don't say it, you've got to assume that they're not doing it. And so therefore, I would go to plant based instead. I would, if I'm going out to eat, I don't go out often. But if I was stuck in that position, I think that's what I would do. I would just go plant based, and I would figure it out afterwards.